In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Colinda was working the North Sea, about 40 kilometers off the English coast, in the dark hours before dawn. The nets came up heavy, not with fish, with a great black lump of peat, dredged from the seabed 60 feet down. That was a nuisance. Peat clogs the nets. So a crewman named Pilgrim Lockwood picked up a shovel to break it apart and throw it back. And the shovel hit something hard, something that rang. Buried inside that lump of ancient bog was a spear point, 21 centimeters long, carved from antler, its edge cut into a row of fine barbs. A harpoon, made by human hands to kill fish or game. And it had been lying on the bottom of the sea for something like 10,000 years. Here is the problem with that spear. Peat does not form on the sea floor. Peat forms on land, in bogs, in marshes, in wet forest. For that lump to exist, the place where the Colinda pulled it up could not always have been sea.
It had been land, dry land, with bogs and forests.
Where did it go?
Land where a
there
person
it is.
once stood, 40 kilometers out into what is now open ocean, and threw a spear. The North Sea, it turned out, was hiding an entire country. We have since learned its shape, its rivers, its forests, and roughly when and how it drowned. We have pulled up the bones of the animals that lived there and the tools of the people who hunted them. And in the last few years, we have started reading its DNA straight out of the mud. This is the story of Doggerland, the lost country beneath the
mountain
North
speaks.
Sea.
Get back!
How we found
It's
it,
coming.
who
Run!
lived
The
there,
sea is quiet today.
and
I
what
wish it would tell us
actually
more.
happened
Be patient.
the day
It
the
knows our
water
crest.
came. And I want to be honest with you up front, because it changes the whole story. The way this is usually told, the way you have probably heard it, is that a single monstrous wave wiped Doggerland off the map in one afternoon. That is not what happened. The truth is slower and stranger, and much harder to live through.
We will get to the wave.
The morning
But
mist
the
is heavy
wave
today.
is not
Yes,
the
it feels
ending
peaceful.
you think it is. Start by deleting the North Sea from your mental map. Today, Britain is an island. A narrow, cold stretch of grey water separates it from the rest of Europe, and that feels permanent. It is not. Britain is only an island when the sea is high, during warm periods like the one we live in now. For most of the last 100,000 years, the sea was not high, and Britain was not an island. It was the northwestern corner of the European mainland, and you could have walked from London to Amsterdam without crossing any
water's
water
calm
at
today.
all.
It's a good day
The
for fishing.
reason is ice. During the last ice age, enormous ice sheets locked up so much of the world's water that the global sea level sat roughly 120 meters lower than it does today. Pull that much water out of the ocean, and the shallow floor of the North Sea simply becomes ground. Dry, walkable, livable ground. And this was not a leftover strip. At its greatest extent, the land between Britain and mainland Europe covered something like 180,000 square kilometers. That is larger than England. It is about 4 times the size of the modern Netherlands. An area that big is not a bridge, it is a country in its own right. For a long time, that is exactly how archaeologists failed to see it. When they thought about the North Sea floor at all, they pictured
Keep
a
a steady
land
course.
bridge, a boring
Check the net again.
corridor that people walked
almost
across on their way from one real place to another. Somewhere you passed
The water is
through,
rising.
not somewhere you
It's coming
lived.
too fast. We
That
have to move.
changed in
Morning breeze is
1998
kind today.
when a British
Indeed. The sea is
archaeologist
calm as
named
well.
Bryony Coles published a paper that gave the place its name. She called it Doggerland
artifact
after
lies
the
this way.
Dogger Bank, a shallow rise in the middle of the North Sea, long known to fishermen. And her argument
range
was
is here.
simple and
We need to follow this
important.
river.
This was not a
beyond the
bridge, it was a homeland. A real landscape with its own hills and valleys and coastlines that people didn't cross, they inhabited. She was right. But in 1998, she was mostly working from theory and a scatter of old finds.
She could name the country. She couldn't yet show you the map. The map came from oil. For decades,
The coast is clear there.
oil and gas
But the mountain pass
companies
is
had
risky.
been firing
I'll mark a
sound
detour.
waves down into the North Sea floor and recording the echoes, searching for petroleum. That data, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of it, described the shape of everything buried under the seabed. It was collected to find
The morning
oil,
mist is heavy.
but a
Yes,
team
it
of
will be a good day.
archaeologists at the University of
wood.
Birmingham and later a project led by Vince Gaffney called Europe's Lost Frontiers realized it could be used to find something else. They took the seismic data
The fishing
and
should be good
read
today.
the
I
buried
think you're
land
right.
back
Let's hope so.
out of it. And a country appeared. Not a vague blob, a landscape. They could trace the winding course of a great river system across the drowned plain. Researchers named it the Southern River. They could see hills, estuaries where rivers met the ancient coast, the basins of former lakes, salt marshes, valleys,
The water is
a
rising.
whole geography
it's covering the huts.
sitting
We need
60,
to find high
70, 100 feet below the waves, mapped in detail, having been dry land within human memory. And the detail was astonishing. This was not a smudge on a chart. Researchers could follow the southern river as it wound across the plain, could see where smaller streams fed into it, could pick out the low hills that would have stood above the floodplain, and the broad basins where lakes once sat. If you had stood on one of those hills 10,000 years ago and looked out, you would not have seen anything strange or primitive. You would have seen a river valley. A landscape any of us would recognize, except that today, every part of it is underwater, and container ships pass overhead where the hills used to be. Doggerland was no longer a theory. It was a place you could point to on a map. So what was it actually like to stand there? For a long time, we could only guess. Then researchers found a way to answer the question directly, by pulling long tubes of sediment, called cores, out of the seabed and reading the DNA trapped inside them. Here is why that works, and it is genuinely remarkable. When a plant or an animal lives and dies, it sheds fragments of its DNA into the soil and water around it. Normally that DNA breaks down fast, but the bottom of the North Sea is a near-perfect refrigerator, a constant 4 degrees Celsius, dark, sealed under mud. Organic material that would rot away in months on a warm shore can survive down there for thousands of years. So an evolutionary geneticist named Robin Alabi at the University of Warwick took hundreds of tiny samples from Gaffney's cores, teaspoon by teaspoon, and sequenced the DNA in each one. Not the DNA of one buried skeleton, the DNA of the entire landscape, shed into the ground and frozen in time. The most recent study, published in 2026, went through 252 samples from over 40 sites along that southern river. And the picture it built is not a bleak frozen waste, it's the opposite. By the early part of our current warm period, Doggerland was, in Alabi's own words, essentially a northern temperate forest. The samples turned up over 500 different kinds of plant. Along the river's mouth, salt marsh and seagrass. Rising up from the water, grassland, then deciduous woodland, willow, alder, elm, hazel, oak. And through the trees moved the animals whose bones the fishing nets keep dragging up. Red deer, wild boar, aurochs, elk, beaver. In the older, colder layers, mammoth and woolly rhinoceros. This was not a place people trudged across to get somewhere better. This was somewhere better. Rich rivers full of fish, forests full of game, an estuary and a coastline which for hunter-gatherers is the richest address on earth. The one place you can harvest the land and the sea at the same time. One archaeologist put it plainly. Doggerland may have been the most desirable territory in all of Europe. And people had been living on it for a very, very long time, far longer than our own species has existed. Because before the modern humans came, the Neanderthals. We know this because their things keep washing up. Off the coast of the Netherlands, dredged from a spot called the Zeeland Ridges, someone recovered a fragment of a human skull, a piece of forehead. It was studied, and it turned out to belong to a Neanderthal, the first Neanderthal fossil ever pulled from the bottom of the sea.
Off the coast of East Anglia, a haul of 75 Neanderthal stone tools came up. These are Middle Paleolithic, tens of thousands of years old, some of the material on the order of 100,000 years or more. Small, hardy bands of Neanderthals, following mammoth and woolly rhinoceros across an icy northern steppe, right where the container ships now cross. And it isn't only Neanderthals, and it isn't only scientists finding it. Along the Dutch coast, engineers have been rebuilding the shoreline by pumping enormous volumes of sand up off the seafloor and spraying it onto the beaches. Projects with names like the Sand Motor and Maasvlakte. And that sand comes up full of the past. Barbed harpoon points, flint tools, fragments of bone. A whole community of local beachcombers now walks these artificial beaches, and they bring what they find to archaeologists like Luc Amkreutz at the National Museum. One of those finds was a Neanderthal tool with the birch tar glue still on the grip, where a hand had pressed it into place. Think about that for a moment. Someone made that tool. They heated birch bark until it gave up a black, sticky tar. They pressed a sharp flint into it and held it there until it set, and they used it. And then it lay in the dark for tens of thousands of years, under a plain, and then under a rising sea. And then it was sucked up a pipe and sprayed onto a modern beach, and a person out walking their dog picked it up. The fingerprints of that maker are, in a sense, still on it. And the flint tools keep coming. A handful of them, found among stones dredged up to build the sea walls of Rotterdam Harbour, hint that modern humans may have been active out there as early as 40,000 years ago, when Doggerland was still a cold, open steppe.
Barbed harpoon points, like the one from the Colinda, turn up again and again. The signature tool of people who lived by the water, who speared fish and fowl in the rivers and marshes of a country that no longer exists. A drowned country, coughing its contents up onto the beach, one tide at a time. So hold that image. A warm, forested, river-braided land, bigger than England, full of game and fish, lived on by Neanderthals, and then by our own ancestors for tens of thousands of years. Now take it away. Around 20,000 years ago, the ice began to melt. It did not melt all at once, and it did not melt gently. As the great ice sheets collapsed, all that locked-up water went back into the sea, and the sea began, slowly and unstoppably, to rise. And Doggerland was uniquely doomed, because Doggerland was flat and low. Think about what rising water does to a steep coast versus a flat one.
On a steep coast, the sea climbs the cliff. You lose a little strip of shoreline and the map barely changes. But Doggerland was a low plain. On a flat plain, every extra meter of sea level does not eat a strip, it swallows kilometers. The water doesn't climb, it spreads.
The storm has passed.
It comes
The moon is
inland
bright
across
tonight.
the flats
Gather
faster
close.
than anything that low and gentle has any right to. So the country began to drown from the edges in. The coastline crept inland. Rivers that had run to a distant sea now met the tide much closer to home. Fresh water turned brackish, then salt. We can actually see this happening in the cores. The sediment records the change from freshwater silt to marine clay, layer by layer, as the sea pushed further up the southern river, decade after decade, century after century. And this is the part that matters, the part I want you to sit with, because it is the true horror of the story, and it is not the part the documentaries usually tell. This did not happen in an afternoon. It happened over thousands of years. And that means no single person ever watched Doggerland drown. What they watched was worse and quieter. A person born on that coast would learn a shoreline as a child. This beach, that river mouth, that stand of trees. And by the time they were old, the shoreline would have moved. The fishing spot their grandmother used was now underwater.
Mountain air.
The
Still
path
cold.
to the summer camp was now a marsh. The land did not vanish in a wave. It leaked away across a human lifetime, and then across the next, and the next. And every generation had to explain to its children that the world used to be bigger. That out there, past the water, there used to be more. And there is something else the rising water did, something crueler than just taking land. As the sea pushed inland, it did not only drown the ground, it poisoned
light is
it
beautiful.
ahead of
Yes,
itself.
the sea is calm today. We should
Salt
hunt
water
soon.
crept up the rivers, turning fresh water brackish. The good hunting marshes soured. The plants changed.
The animals moved. Long before a place was actually underwater, it stopped being able to feed you. The country was dying from the inside, as well as shrinking from the edge, and the people living there would have felt the land grow poorer under their feet, season by season, without ever fully understanding why. Slowly, the country broke apart. What had been one solid landmass became a great archipelago. The high ground, the Dogger Bank itself, surviving as a large island in a widening sea, while the low ground vanished around it. Around 9,000 years ago, there was still a Dogger archipelago. People almost certainly still lived on it, clinging to the last highland, watching the horizon of water close in from every side. And then, into that drowning, half-swallowed world came the wave. Off the coast of Norway, about 8,150 years ago, the edge of the continental shelf gave way.
It is called the Storegga Slide, from the Old Norse for the Great Edge, and it is one of the largest landslides known from anywhere in the last 10,000 years. A piece of the seafloor the size of a small country, more than 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock and sediment, broke loose and slid into the deep Norwegian Sea. Debris spread across 80,000 square kilometers of ocean floor, running out more than halfway to Iceland. When that much material moves that fast underwater, it shoves the ocean above it. It makes a tsunami. And this was an enormous one. The geological fingerprints of the wave are found all around the northern seas. In Norway, in Scotland, in the Faroe Islands, in Denmark, even Greenland. On the Shetland Islands, the water ran up the land to a height of around 20 meters. 20 meters, a wall of water taller than a 5-story building, arriving on the doorstep of a drowning country whose people were already crowded onto their last islands. For a long time, this was assumed to be the ending.
Look at the size
The
of that
neat,
wave. It moves
dramatic,
so slowly, and it's
cinematic
massive.
ending.
I hope it doesn't reach the village.
Doggerland, the lost country, finished off in a single, terrible afternoon by a monster wave. That is the version that makes headlines. It is the version you have probably heard. The real story is stranger, and we only got it recently. In 2020, a team led by James Walker, working with Vince Gaffney and the Lost Frontiers course, went looking for that wave in the southern North Sea, the part of the basin where Doggerland's last islands actually sat. They found it. In a core called ELF-001A, drawn from a buried river channel of the Lincolnshire coast, they identified the Storegga deposit, the physical signature of the tsunami, right where it should be. But two things about it changed the story. First, the sand from the wave was overlain by ordinary lake and river sediment, meaning, after the tsunami swept through, the land was still there. The water came, and then it drained, and life on that patch of ground went on. The wave was not the end of that place. And second, the bigger point, by the time the wave arrived, most of Doggerland was already gone. It had already drowned, slowly,
over the preceding thousands of years from the relentless rise of the sea. The Storegga tsunami did not sink a thriving country. It crashed over the last shreds of one that was almost entirely underwater already. It was devastating for whoever was on the final islands, and that is a real horror, people on their last high ground hit by a 20-meter wave. But it was the final blow to a country that had been dying for millennia, not the cause of death, the last punctuation mark. More recent work keeps refining this. In 2024, researchers found a possible trace of the same tsunami far to the south, on the German coast, pushing the known reach of the wave further than before. The picture keeps getting sharper.
But the shape of it holds. Doggerland was not murdered in an afternoon. It was slowly taken by the sea, and the famous Great Wave was almost the last thing to touch it, not the first. By around 7,500 years ago, it was effectively over. The high ground of the Dogger Bank became the last island, and then it too slipped under. And by about 5,500 years ago, the map of Northwest Europe looked the way it looks today. Britain was an island. The country in between was gone. And within a few generations, the people who remembered it were gone too, and there was no writing to hold what they knew. The memory of Doggerland did not survive as a story. It survived as mud and bone and DNA, waiting on the seafloor for someone to come back and read it. So put the whole thing together. There was a country in the North Sea, bigger than England, forested, watered, full of game. For a stretch, perhaps the finest land in Europe. Neanderthals lived there. Then our own ancestors lived there for thousands of years, born and buried on ground that is now 60 feet underwater. And it did not die in a disaster. It died the way an entire world can die without a single dramatic moment, slowly, at the edges, one lost shoreline at a time, until the people who lived there had to teach their children that the world used to be larger. That was the real catastrophe. Not the wave, the water that never stopped rising. We only know any of this because a fishing net snagged the lump of peat in 1931 and the man with a shovel hit something that rang. Because oil companies mapped the seafloor for profit and archaeologists read the country back out of the data. Because the mud at the bottom of the North Sea kept the DNA of a vanished forest cold enough to survive 10,000 years. There is a reason this story feels less comfortable now than it did when Coles named the place in 1998. Doggerland drowned because the ice melted and the sea rose. That is exactly the process happening today, on coastlines where hundreds of millions of people currently live. Doggerland is not just a lost world. It is a rehearsal we already ran once, with people in it. A whole country, taken slowly by rising water, until all that was left was what the sea chose to keep. We tend to think of a drowning country as something that could only happen in the deep past, to primitive people, in a world unlike ours. It isn't. The mechanism is identical. Ice melts, water goes into the sea rises, and the flattest, lowest, most fertile land, which is exactly the land people most want to live on, goes first. Doggerland was low and flat and rich, and that is precisely why it was doomed. The same is true of a great deal of the coastline that human beings crowd onto today. The people of Doggerland had nowhere to go but inland, onto higher ground, carrying the memory of a bigger world.
That memory is the last thing to survive. And that's what the next one is about. The flat stories. Because nearly every culture on Earth remembers a time when the water rose and the land went under. Most people assume those are just myths. Some of them might be something else. I'm long before us,